The crimson suns of Kepler 442b cast long shadows across the crystalline spires of Ethros, their light refracting through the city's bioluminescent walls in patterns that would have been beautiful if Commander Jake Morrison hadn't been watching for enemy movement between each prismatic flicker. His tactical visor hummed softly as it analyzed atmospheric conditions, oxygen levels stable, gravity at 92% Earth normal, and enough electromagnetic interference to make his grandmother's pacemaker throw a tantrum. Another day in paradise, he muttered into his comm unit, adjusting the plasma rifle slung across his shoulder. The weapon's power cell glowed a reassuring blue, though Morrison had learned not to trust reassuring glows on alien worlds. Last month on Proxima Station, a reassuring glow had turned out to be a methane leak that nearly barbecued his entire squad. The joint defensive perimeter stretched across the city's eastern approach, where human and Veltha forces had managed to create something that almost resembled cooperation. Almost. Morrison watched a group of Veltha soldiers practicing their ceremonial combat forms with weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a battlefield. Their movements were precise, elegant, and about as practical as using a teacup to bail water from a sinking ship. Commander Morrison, Lieutenant Sarah Chen's voice crackled through his earpiece, laced with poorly concealed amusement. "We've got incoming VIP transport. Guess who's decided to grace us with her presence?" Morrison's stomach dropped like a malfunctioning gravity generator. "Please tell me it's the local equivalent of a pizza delivery." "Negative, sir. It's the Empress herself. ETA 15 minutes. He groaned and kicked at a chunk of crystallized debris. The stuff was everywhere. Apparently, Veltha architecture had all the structural integrity of spun sugar when exposed to quantum bombardment. Outstanding. Just what we need during a potential siege. Royalty with a death wish. The transport descended through the twin suns' glare like a silver teardrop, its anti-gravity engines humming with the kind of smooth efficiency that made human technology look like it had been assembled by caffeinated monkeys. Morrison straightened his uniform, checked his weapon seals, and tried to remember which fork to use if the Empress decided to throw an impromptu dinner party in the middle of a war zone. The transport touched down with barely a whisper, its hull gleaming with embedded circuitry that pulsed like a living heartbeat. The boarding ramp descended with ceremonial slowness, and Morrison caught his first glimpse of the infamous Praetorian Guard. They moved with the fluid precision of dancers, their armor shifting colors to match their surroundings, energy shields shimmering around them like heat mirages. Then she stepped into view. Empress Lyralii was smaller than Morrison had expected, but there was something in the way she carried herself that made the air seem denser around her. Her skin held the pale luminescence common to her species, and her hair fell in waves that caught the crimson sunlight like liquid copper. But it was her ears that marked her as unmistakably other, long and elegantly pointed, curved like crescent moons, tipped with the faintest trace of silver. She surveyed the defensive positions with eyes that missed nothing, her gaze finally settling on Morrison. He straightened reflexively, then caught himself and forced his shoulders to relax. No point in looking like a statue when he felt like a deer caught in headlights. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that all Velthrans possessed but somehow warmer, more approachable. "I trust our forces are prepared for what's coming." Morrison glanced at the nearest group of her Praetorian guards, who stood at attention like they were posing for a recruitment poster. "Well, Your Majesty, we've got enough firepower to level a small moon, and your boys there look pretty enough to be in a holographic calendar. Whether that translates to stopping a hegemony assault." He shrugged. "Ask me again tomorrow. Assuming we're all still breathing." Several of the Praetorians stiffened at his casual tone, hands drifting toward their weapons. The Empress, however, smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face. "You humans have such an interesting relationship with mortality," she said. "Tell me, do you always joke in the face of danger?" Morrison checked his chronometer and grinned. "Only on days ending in Y, Your Majesty. It's either laugh or cry, and tears freeze in vacuum. Bad for the equipment." She laughed then, a sound like wind chimes in a gentle breeze, and Morrison felt something shift in the air around them. The Praetorians relaxed marginally, though they continued to scan the horizon with professional paranoia. In the distance, the first stars were beginning to appear as the twin suns sank toward the crystalline mountains, and Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that tomorrow would bring more than just another sunrise. "Show me your defensive preparations, Commander," the Empress said, stepping closer to examine his tactical display. "I want to understand how humans think about warfare." As Morrison began explaining their overlapping fields of fire and fallback positions, he found himself wondering if the rebels massing in the nebula fields knew they were about to face something more dangerous than just superior firepower. They were about to face humans with something to prove, and that was usually when things got interesting. The quantum disruptors hit Ethros like invisible hammers, phasing through the city's energy shields as if they were morning mist. Morrison felt the first tremor through his boots, followed by the distinctive whine of crystalline architecture beginning its death song. The bioluminescent walls flickered from their usual warm gold to an alarming shade of emergency red, casting everything in the color of fresh blood. "Well, that's not ominous at all," Morrison muttered, watching his tactical display light up like a Christmas tree in hell. Hegemony signatures were materializing all across the city's perimeter, their stealth systems finally overloaded by the massive energy discharge of their opening volley. The Empress had been examining a plasma cannon emplacement when the attack began, her pointed ears twitching slightly at frequencies human hearing couldn't detect. Now she stood frozen, not in fear, but in what Morrison recognized as the terrible moment of realization that everything you'd planned for was about to go sideways. "Your Majesty," he called out, checking his weapon's charge level, "I hate to interrupt your sightseeing tour, but we've got party crashers." One of the Praetorian guards stepped forward, his armor's camouflage shifting to match the emergency lighting. "Empress, we must evacuate immediately. The defensive perimeter is compromised." Morrison watched in fascination as more of the elite guards appeared from their concealed positions. They moved with liquid grace, their energy weapons humming to life, but there was something in their body language that set off every alarm bell in his combat-trained brain. They weren't moving toward the enemy. They were moving toward the landing pad. "Disco chicken to funky badger," Morrison spoke into his comm, using the ridiculous call signs his squad had adopted after discovering that hegemony intelligence was terrible at decoding human humor. "The fancy-eared cavalry seems to be developing a sudden case of strategic repositioning syndrome." Lieutenant Chen's voice crackled back through increasing interference. "Copy that, Disco chicken. Should we expect them for the after-party, or are they heading home early?" Morrison watched as the first group of Praetorians reached their transport, their movements becoming more urgent as the city's death throes grew louder. A crystalline spire 2 kilometers away collapsed in slow motion, its structure failing from the bottom up like a house of cards in reverse. The sight would have been beautiful if it hadn't meant that several thousand civilians were about to have a very bad day. "I'm thinking early departure," Morrison replied, his voice tight. "Question is, are they taking the guest of honor with them?" The Empress seemed to have reached the same conclusion. Her luminescent skin had taken on a paler shade, and her pointed ears were pressed back against her skull in what Morrison was beginning to recognize as Vaelthran distress. She turned toward her remaining guards, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to command. "Hold positions," she ordered. "We defend this sector." The lead Praetorian hesitated, his helmet's faceplate reflecting the chaotic light show erupting across the city. "Your Imperial Majesty, our primary directive is your safety. The city is lost." Morrison felt his stomach drop as he watched more guards edge toward the transport. These weren't just elite soldiers, they were supposedly blood-bound to die for their Empress. The kind of fanatic loyalty that made suicide charges look like casual strolls. Yet here they were, calculating odds like accountants at tax time. "Lost?" The Empress's voice carried a dangerous edge. "The battle has barely begun." Another spire collapsed, this one close enough that Morrison could feel the ground shake. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning ozone and something else, something that reminded him of melted electronics mixed with overripe fruit. Probably the bioluminescent power cores failing, he thought. Or possibly the local equivalent of barbecue, which would be just his luck. Funky badger to disco chicken, Chen's voice was getting harder to hear through the static. We've got hegemony assault mechs moving through Sector 7. Big ones. The kind that make our tanks look like angry toasters. Morrison glanced at his tactical display, which was now showing more red contacts than a dating app convention. The hegemony had committed serious resources to this attack: orbital bombardment platforms, heavy armor, enough firepower to crack a moon. And they were all converging on the city center, where a certain pointed-eared dignitary was currently discovering that loyalty wasn't as reliable as advertised. Your Majesty, the Praetorian Guard captain said, his voice carrying the tone of someone delivering bad news to a superior who could have him vaporized. The quantum disruptors have destabilized the city's foundation matrix. Structural collapse is inevitable. Morrison watched as the Empress absorbed this information, her expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked suspiciously like heartbreak. Around her, more guards were abandoning their positions, their blood oaths apparently having fine print that included escape clauses for impossible odds. Well, Morrison said, hefting his plasma rifle and checking the power cell one more time, this is either going to be really heroic or really stupid. Possibly both. The Empress looked at him, her eyes reflecting the emergency lighting like fractured starlight. Commander, you should evacuate with your forces. Morrison grinned, the expression feeling somewhat manic even to him. See, that's where you're wrong, Your Majesty. My squad might be crazy enough to follow me into a black hole, but they're not nearly crazy enough to follow me into explaining to Earth Command why we left an allied head of state to get turned into fancy alien paste. As if summoned by his words, the sound of approaching hegemony forces echoed through the crystalline canyons of Ethros, the deep thrum of anti-gravity engines mixed with the distinctive whine of charging plasma weapons. In the distance, the last transport carrying the Praetorian Guard lifted off, leaving behind nothing but the smell of burnt atmosphere and broken promises. The hegemony assault mechs rounded the corner like metallic nightmares, their particle cannons already glowing with lethal intent. Morrison took one look at the advancing wall of death and made a decision that his tactical training would have classified somewhere between monumentally stupid and cosmically suicidal. Change of plans, Your Majesty, he said, grabbing the Empress by the arm and pulling her toward the nearest transit tube entrance. We're going on an impromptu tour of your city's scenic underground. The Empress stumbled, her pointed ears flattening against her skull as plasma fire erupted behind them. Commander, this is not strategic withdrawal, this is abandoning the defensive perimeter. Yeah, well, my strategic withdrawal manual doesn't have a chapter on what to do when your allies run away and leave you holding the bag, Morrison replied, diving through the transit tube's biomembrane seal just as a particle beam carved through the space where his head had been. I'm improvising. The transit system had seen better days. What should have been a smooth ride through Ethros's crystalline arteries had become a lurching nightmare as the city's bioneural network suffered cascading failures. Emergency lighting flickered on and off like a cosmic strobe light, and Morrison's stomach informed him that artificial gravity was apparently optional in this particular corner of the universe. Disco chicken to anyone who's still breathing, Morrison spoke into his comm as they tumbled through a tube that seemed to be having an identity crisis about which direction constituted BUP. I'm currently playing tourist guide to our distinguished guest. If anyone has suggestions for local attractions that aren't currently being reduced to subatomic particles, I'm all ears. Static answered him, punctuated by what sounded like Lieutenant Chin cursing in 3 different languages. At least some of his people were still alive, which was more than he'd expected after watching those Praetorian guards demonstrate their mastery of the strategic retreat. The Empress had recovered her composure with impressive speed, her luminescent skin adapting to the erratic lighting conditions. The biotransit system connects to the old city core, she said, her voice steady despite their current resemblance to passengers in a cosmic washing machine. If we can reach the central nexus. Let me guess, Morrison interrupted as they shot through what felt like a 90-degree turn designed by someone who'd never heard of inertia. Ancient Veiltha technology that makes our stuff look like we're still hitting rocks with bigger rocks. Something like that. The Empress almost smiled, despite the circumstances. Though your people's tendency to over-engineer simple solutions has its own charm. Morrison's plasma rifle chose that moment to overheat, its power cell cycling through colors that probably violated several laws of physics. He watched the weapon's diagnostic display flash cheerful warnings about thermal overload, critical system failure, and something called cascade resonance deviation that sounded expensive to fix. Outstanding, he muttered, watching his primary weapon transform itself into an overpriced paperweight. Note to self, file a complaint with the manufacturer about truth in advertising. They emerged from a transit tube into a chamber that belonged in a cathedral rather than a subway system. Crystalline walls stretched upward into darkness, their surfaces covered with flowing script that seemed to write and rewrite itself as Morrison watched. The Empress's ears perked up, and she moved toward the nearest wall with something approaching reverence. "These are the city's memory cores," she said, her fingers tracing patterns in the living crystal. "The accumulated knowledge of 10,000 years." "Fascinating," Morrison said, checking his remaining weapons. 3 grenades, a sidearm with half a charge, and a combat knife that had seen better decades. "Can your accumulated knowledge tell us how to get out of here without becoming part of the local archaeological record?" The sound of grinding metal echoed through the chamber, followed by the distinctive whine of hegemony hover scouts. Morrison counted at least 6 distinct engine signatures, which meant they were about to have company with serious firepower and questionable social skills. There, the Empress pointed toward a passage that seemed to spiral deeper into the city's heart. The emergency protocols should still be active. They ran through corridors that shifted around them like a living maze, the city's dying neural network trying to maintain some semblance of function. Morrison's grenades proved less effective than advertised. Apparently, hegemony battle armor had improved since the last intelligence briefing. His sidearm managed to disable one hover scout before its power cell gave up with what sounded suspiciously like an electronic sigh of resignation. "This is like a really expensive video game," Morrison panted as they ducked through another membrane seal, "except when you die, you don't get to start over with better equipment." The Empress was keeping pace despite what looked like a nasty cut along her arm where debris had caught her. Her alien physiology seemed to be handling the stress better than his purely human biology, though Morrison noticed she was favoring her left side. "Your Majesty, not to be presumptuous, but are you bleeding anything that's going to attract local predators? Because my day really doesn't need that kind of enhancement." She glanced down at the wound, her expression suggesting she'd forgotten about it entirely. "Veiltha blood is copper-based. Most predators find it unpalatable." "Good to know. I was running out of ways to make this situation more complicated." They reached what appeared to be the city's central core just as Morrison's last grenade proved that hegemony engineers had a sense of humor. The explosion bounced off their target's shields and took out a support beam that had probably been holding up something important. The chamber filled with the sound of cascading structural failure, and Morrison found himself wondering if his life insurance covered death by ironic friendly fire. The Empress was working at some kind of control interface, her fingers dancing across crystalline keys that responded to her touch with musical tones. "The defense grid is still partially active," she said, her pointed ears twitching as she concentrated. "But it requires manual activation." Morrison looked around the chamber, noting the obvious lack of cover and the equally obvious presence of hegemony forces converging on their position. "Define manual activation, because if it involves standing in the open while pushing buttons, I'm going to have to vote against that plan." The Empress's expression shifted to something that might have been determination or possibly resignation. "It requires someone to maintain contact with the interface while the system cycles through defensive protocols. Approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds of standing perfectly still while people shoot at us." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Yeah, that sounds about right for how this day's been going." Morrison positioned himself between the Empress and the chamber's main entrance, his combat knife feeling absurdly inadequate against the approaching hegemony forces. The crystalline interface pulsed with anticipatory light as the Empress placed her palms against its surface, her pointed ears rigid with concentration. 30 seconds, she repeated, her voice steady despite the plasma fire beginning to echo through the outer corridors. The defense grid will activate automatically once the sequence completes. Right, Morrison said, checking his chronometer. 30 seconds of me pretending to be a human shield while you commune with ancient alien technology. This is either going to be really heroic or really embarrassing. Possibly both. The first hegemony soldiers appeared at the chamber's entrance, sleek figures in adaptive armor that made them look like predatory shadows. Morrison counted 6, then 12, then stopped counting because mathematics wasn't going to make this any less ridiculous. You know, Your Majesty, Morrison called over his shoulder, when I joined the military, the recruiter never mentioned that my job description would eventually include standing between alien royalty and certain death armed with a knife older than my grandmother's dentures. The Empress's laugh was breathless but genuine. Perhaps you should request a job transfer. I tried. Apparently, cosmic babysitting isn't a recognized military occupational specialty. The hegemony forces opened fire, their particle beams carving through the crystalline walls like hot knives through butter. Morrison dove behind a control console that provided about as much protection as a paper umbrella in a hurricane, dragging the Empress down with him. Her hands maintained contact with the interface, blue energy crawling up her arms like living circuitry. How much longer? Morrison shouted, wincing as another beam passed close enough to singe his eyebrows. 20 seconds. Morrison's combat knife proved surprisingly effective at deflecting energy weapons. Apparently, the Veilthrans had crafted their ceremonial weapons from materials that human science hadn't quite figured out yet. He managed to redirect several shots back at their sources, though his technique resembled someone trying to swat flies with a butter knife more than any recognized combat form. Well, Your Majesty, looks like this human's warranty just expired, he said, watching more hegemony soldiers pour into the chamber. His knife was glowing cherry red from the energy it had absorbed, and he was running out of creative ways to avoid being vaporized. 10 seconds, the Empress gasped, her entire body now outlined in cascading blue light. That's when Morrison heard the most beautiful sound in the universe, the distinctive whine of human plasma weapons warming up. Lieutenant Chen's voice crackled through his comm, clear for the first time in hours. Disco Chicken, this is Funky Badger. We brought party favors. The chamber erupted into chaos as Morrison's surviving squad members stormed the entrance, their weapons cutting through hegemony ranks with the efficiency of people who'd spent months learning to work together. Chen appeared at Morrison's elbow, her uniform singed but her grin intact. Couldn't let you have all the fun, sir. Besides, someone has to be around to fill out the paperwork when this is over. The Empress's eyes snapped open as the interface completed its sequence, the chamber filling with harmonious tones that seemed to resonate through the city's crystalline structure. Above them, dormant defense systems came online with the mechanical precision of awakening giants. Morrison watched through the chamber's transparent dome as Ethros revealed its true nature. The city wasn't just a collection of beautiful spires. It was a single, massive organism, and it was very, very angry. Crystalline weapons emerged from hidden recesses, their targeting systems locking onto hegemony forces with the patience of a predator that had been waiting millennia for this moment. That's going to leave a mark, Morrison observed as the city's main defense cannon, a structure the size of a skyscraper, began charging with enough energy to crack a small asteroid. The battle turned in minutes rather than hours. Hegemony forces found themselves fighting not just human and Veiltha soldiers, but the city itself. Their assault mechs, so terrifying in the open corridors, became sitting targets as the walls themselves began firing. Their hover scouts discovered that the air itself had turned hostile as crystalline interceptors emerged from what had appeared to be decorative elements. When the dust settled, Morrison found himself sitting beside the Empress on the steps of her command center, both of them looking like they'd been through a cosmic blender. Her pointed ears drooped with exhaustion, and he was pretty sure his left boot was melting. So, Morrison said, watching hegemony prisoners being processed by joint human Veiltha forces, what's the official protocol when alien nobility gets abandoned by their bodyguards and has to be rescued by a human with delusions of heroism? The Empress considered this seriously. I believe the traditional response involves a medal ceremony, a feast, and several speeches about honor and duty. Sounds awful. Can I just get a commendation letter and some decent coffee instead? She smiled, and Morrison realized that somewhere between the plasma fire and the cosmic jokes, something had fundamentally shifted. The careful diplomatic distance between their species, the assumption that humans and Veilthrans were too different to truly understand each other, it had all burned away in the crucible of shared danger and terrible humor. "Commander Morrison," she said formally, though her eyes held warmth that hadn't been there before, "would you be interested in a new assignment? Something involving long-term cultural exchange and mutual defense planning?" Morrison looked around at the ruins of what had been an impregnable city, at his squad members comparing war stories with Veiltha soldiers who'd stayed to fight, at the debris field where hegemony forces had learned that some alliances were stronger than blood oaths or political convenience. "Your Majesty," he said, "I thought you'd never ask." As the twin suns set over Ethros, painting the crystalline walls in shades of gold and crimson, Morrison reflected that perhaps the universe had a sense of humor after all. He'd come to this world expecting to fight alongside aliens he barely understood, and instead had found something he'd never expected, the kind of partnership that could only be forged in shared laughter and mutual trust, even when everything else fell apart.